Welcome back to my channel. January 1706 to May 1875, across the southern plains, the Numunu, also known as the Comanche, turned grass into horses and horses into power. Dawn wind runs over Llano Estacado, and a line of riders slides along the caprock. Hoofbeats fold into the land. From the Arkansas River to the Rio Grande, and from the cross timbers to the Pecos country routes link winter canyons to summer hunts and trade towns on every edge. Taos, Santa Fe, and the line of New Mexico plazas pull hides and meat and horses outward, while iron cloth and powder flow back. Speed decides when to appear and when to vanish, and for long years, the choice belongs to the riders. Bands shape the field. Noconi, Cotzateca, Penateca, Yamparica, and later Quahati hold grass and water by season and agreement. Camp circles rise where shelter and fuel allow. Scouts read buffalo and weather. Traders set out with pack trains at first light. Across the south, ranching valleys in Chihuahua and Coahuila feel the reach of mounted columns that strike and return along known canyons. To the east, the Republic of Texas pushes west with rangers, militias, and settlers, and after annexation, the United States Army lays a cordon of posts and sends scouts toward the high plain. Each side has aims and limits. Numunu objectives are grass for herds, a steady hunt, control of passage, and leverage in trade. Texas and Mexico seek secure roads, towns, and ranches. New Mexico seeks exchange without loss. The Army seeks fixed peace on mapped ground. The system runs on animals, landscape, and markets. Horse herds multiply distance. Bison turn grass into food and hides. Ledgers in border towns record prices that make raids and trade part of one economy. Disease strikes at intervals and takes a heavy toll, yet the framework holds because the roots hold and the horses hold. The result is regional power built on movement rather than walls. The question is direct, and it sets the work of this film. How did a horse economy become an empire in practice? And why did it fail within one hard season? What forces gathered to end freedom of movement between 1874 and 1875? And why did surrender at Fort Sill follow? The answer matters because it shows how landscape animals, trade, and policy can build power over decades and undo it in a year while a nation continues beyond the fall of its system. Before 1700, Apache groups ranged across much of the southern plains. Spanish entradas from New Mexico and the Rio Grande brought horses' iron and new diseases. Shoshone speakers moved south onto open grass and waterheads. These groups became the Numunu, known in English as the Comanche. They learned mounted war fast. They gathered herds. They mapped a seasonal round that linked winter canyons to summer hunts. Grass and water fixed the calendar. Horses multiplied distance. Bison turned grass into food hides and trade. By the early 1700s, New Mexico towns formed a market rim. Taos and Santa Fe pulled hides, meat, and animals. Iron cloth and powder pushed back along the same roads. Middle traders, later called Comancheros, carried packs out to the plains. Exchange normalized risk. Raids and trade sat on one scale. Silver goods, livestock, and captives moved both ways. Disease shocks hit hard, yet the structure held. Horse numbers restored reach after each wave. The open country stayed open because the Numunu could move faster than their rivals. In the 1760s to 1780s, Spanish officials tried alternating pressure and peace. They sent embassies and gifts. They sought to redirect raids away from New Mexico toward enemies elsewhere. Treaties created intervals of lower loss. None removed the core leverage of horses, grass, and roots. The 18th century closed with Numunu bands holding initiative from the Arkansas River to the upper Nueces country. The term Comancheria, later used by scholars, describes this lived geography. Its lines were seasonal and elastic rather than fixed. The 19th century brought new actors. In 1836, the Republic of Texas claimed wide ground to the west. Militias and ranger companies formed. Settlements pushed toward the cross timbers and beyond. Objectives were land roads and security. Constraints were men, money, and distance. For Texas, the logistics problem was simple and brutal. Water was scarce on the high plains. Patrols on foot could not chase riders who lived with their herds. Mounted companies needed forage for their own stock and depots that did not yet exist. After annexation in 1845, the United States Army built a chain of posts. Forts on the Brazos and the Clear Fork, and later on the Canadian and the Red River served as patrol bases. The objective was to project presence and to protect routes. The constraint was terrain. The Llano Estacado has few landmarks and long dry stretches. Wagons lagged. Patrols lost contact with columns. Mail and telegraph lines were vulnerable. The Army imported civilian guides and Allied scouts to read the land. To the south and west, the Mexican states of Coahuila and Chihuahua faced deep mounted strikes. Ranches and towns along river valleys were targets. Garrison strength was thin. Budgets were unstable. Cavalry horses died fast on long chases. The objective was to keep ranches working and caravans moving. The constraint was that a column could not hold the field without feed and water. Garrisons learned to watch canyons and fords. They also bargained. Some raids ended as exchanges under threat. New Mexico remained a market link after the United States took the territory. Towns needed animals and hides. Traders needed safe passage. Officials tried to regulate exchange through licensed traffic. That system worked when forts deterred free raiding and when prices favored trade over theft. It failed when soldiers moved east for other wars or when prices surged. The plains economy flexed and found its own balance. By the 1860s, larger forces aligned. The Civil War drew federal troops away and then sent them back with more men and better rifles. Railroads reached Kansas towns. New guns and more buyers turned buffalo into cash. The southern herd began to fall in the early 1870s. This was a structural loss for the Numunu. Bison meat, hide, sinew, and bone underpinned diet, trade, ceremony, and status. When herds thinned, the seasonal round lost its center. Federal policy shifted in the same decade. The peace policy under President Grant placed many nations under interior control. Agents promised annuities, rations, and gear in exchange for settlement and peace. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge in 1867 created a reservation frame for the southern plains. It also tied off reservation hunting rights to the presence of buffalo on traditional grounds. As hide hunters cleared the range, that clause turned into a trap. The letter of the treaty remained, while the basis of the hunt vanished. Agency practice added pressure. Issue days fixed food to rolls and compliance. Delays and shortfalls drove hunger. School placements took children from the seasonal round. Blacksmith shops and farm tools tried to redirect labor into fenced fields. Some families adapted parts of the plan. Others rode out to find game and risked patrols. Each winter without buffalo pushed more people toward agency control. Objectives and constraints set the board for each side. Numunu aims were grass for herds, access to bison, control of passage, and leverage in trade. Constraints were disease losses, gunpowder supply, and the rising risk of meeting long-range rifles near ranches, towns, and posts. Texas sought stable settlement and safe roads across river crossings and trails. Constraints were manpower distance and the weakness of feed and water points. New Mexico sought balance between trade and safety. Constraints were thin patrols and market dependence. Mexico sought to hold ranch labor and valley towns. Constraints were sparse cavalry and long borders. The United States Army sought to end raiding and to fix peace on mapped ground. Constraints were cost terrain and the endurance of mounted opponents. Immediate triggers accumulated by season. Harsh winters forced deeper raiding for livestock. Arrests after market disputes inflamed councils. Disarmament efforts at agencies produced walkouts. Ration cuts in lean years pushed families to the plains when patrols were thickest. The hide trade around new railheads set up direct conflict with hunting parties. Each episode chipped away at the old option set. By 1873 and 1874, the combination of empty ranges, stronger posts, and tighter agency control turned mobility into exposure. The buildup was complete. Pressure would now be applied by converging columns and by markets that did not pause. Winter settled hard on the southern plains in early 1840, and meetings in Penateca circles weighed losses from Texas pushes against the need to keep horse herds strong. In spring, small parties scouted the Guadalupe and Colorado crossings. By August, a large mounted force crossed the lower country and struck Victoria and then Linville on the coast. Warehouses burned. Goods were lifted and pack animals loaded on the sand flats. The force turned northwest along known drainages toward the Balcones edge. Citizen companies and ranger units gathered to block exits. On the prairie near Plum Creek, a running fight formed. Reports of casualties differ, and the range of lost numbers reflects the speed and dust of the day. The column reached the hill country with much of its haul still intact. The outcome carried two signals. Towns at the rim were exposed when patrols were thin, and the mounted column could still choose roads and exits. Texas responses followed. Patrol schedules tightened. Bounties on stolen stock were posted. Yet the distances and the need for forage kept most chases short. In New Mexico, the same year fit a different pattern. Taos and Santa Fe depended on exchange with plains peoples. Traders who would later be called Comancheros loaded wool blankets, iron tools, and powder, and moved into the grass when the weather was fair. The risk of seizure or arrest never erased the market. In late autumn, caravans from Mora and Las Vegas met Numunu bands near the edges of timber and water. Exchange was brisk. The border market reduced pressure on plazas when prices were stable and patrols were not ambitious. It increased pressure when soldiers tried to bar licensed traffic and pushed it into unregulated canyons. Signals ran faster than soldiers. Word moved by courier from plaza to settlement in a day. A column on wagons could take 3 days to reach the same crossing. On the high plains, the 1850s added new actors and tools. The Texas frontier stepped past the crossed timbers. Camp Cooper and Fort Belknap served as forward anchors. Tonkawa scouts under Ranger command moved with speed through cedar breaks and river bends. In May 1858, a force under a Texas commander crossed the Red River in what Rangers called a punitive expedition into the Canadian river country. Morning light found lodges near Little Robe Creek. Fighting unfolded in separate contacts along the breaks. Several leaders in Comanche circles were killed in close fights. Ranger reports use firm numbers. Later reviews note that many dead were women and children caught in flight. The raid carried a tactical success for the state's side and a strategic lesson for the Numunu. Lines once respected by officials were no longer restraints. Pursuers could now enter the open country with allied scouts and local guides. That fact changed the weight given to wintering spots near the Canadian and the Washita. Families shifted camp deeper into the Caprock country and made wider arcs between summer hunts and winter timber. The rising cost of mistakes was visible in burned lodges and empty saddle lines. Signals and delays shaped outcomes as much as rifle fire. Telegraph lines stretched out of San Antonio and farther north during the decade, but the wires stopped short of the high plain. A warning from a settlement could reach a district center in an hour by wire. Orders to a fort still needed a courier who changed horses at river crossings and kept to the known mail roads. Interpreters at agencies and posts added another delay. Treaties and surrenders would pivot on a sentence. One word could mean pasture rather than field, or travel rather than removal. Meetings in large councils tended to move around those gaps, but the record shows the misfires. The war years of the early 1860s pulled federal troops east and south. Patrols along the Brazos and the Clear Fork thinned. For a time, the open country felt more open. When federal columns returned after 1865, they carried better rifles and more wagons. They also carried a new understanding of supply. Posts on the Canadian and the Arkansas tied to Kansas railheads. Buffalo hide buyers set up accounts and storage near those lines. The market for hides rose steeply. The balance of risk on the plains shifted. A hunter with a heavy rifle behind a sod wall could match or overmatch a mounted charge in open light. That lesson became clear in a single dawn in June 1874, when a large force of Comanche Kiowa and Southern Cheyenne attacked the settlement at adobe walls in the Canadian river breaks. The hunters held behind thick walls and long guns. Casualty numbers on both sides were limited, but the message ran far. Walls and long-range rifles could break the old calculus of speed and surprise. Couriers carried the news to posts on the line from Fort Dodge and to agencies to the south. The event moved federal planning toward converging columns for the next season. A decade earlier, New Mexico saw a different kind of fight near the same name. In November 1864, a column under a federal officer moved out from the Canadian line toward adobe walls in a sweep meant to punish raids and to break camps. Kiowa and Comanche forces met the column and fought it to a standstill among timber and sand hills. Cannon fire and skirmish lines made a stalemate of the day. The column withdrew with loss after burning abandoned lodges and killing livestock. The first adobe walls showed that a formal column could be slowed by terrain and by layered defense. The second showed that a trading post with long guns could hold under siege. For the Numunu, the pair traced a narrowing lane between two kinds of risk. Open camps invited a sweep. Assaulting a fixed point invited heavy loss under rifles that reached farther each year. Agency politics added friction to all plans. After 1867 at Medicine Lodge, the written word tied hunting rights to the presence of buffalo. The clause looked balanced when herds were still heavy. By 1872 and 1873, hide hunters carried the southern herd toward collapse. In practice, the right to hunt shifted from a seasonal guarantee to a route into arrest. If a family left the agency to seek game and met a patrol, the meeting could end in disarmament or in a fight. Councils argued that the treaty named the open hunt and not a pass system. Agents pointed to their orders and to the vanishing herds. The point here is simple. The law on paper said one thing, the land said another. The mismatch produced more contact and more arrests as the winters passed. A trader in Taos left a line that catches the middle ground between fear and routine. Unknown, untrader letter excerpt, Taos, New Mexico, autumn 1847. We go out with wool and iron, and we come back with hides and animals when the weather and the talk allow. We bring rumor first, then we bring goods. We are watched, and we watch. By spring 1874, the pattern of rising incidents closed into one shape. Settlements and ranches from the Balcones edge to the Red River carried fresh scars from raids and counter-raids. Posts in Indian Territory and New Mexico had standing orders to press outward. Hunters on the Canadian had tasted a siege and had sent their own messages east about range and profit. The Numunu and allied camps counted horse herds thinned by winter and by earlier sweeps. Scouts reported that soldiers drilled more often and drilled with allied guides who knew cutbanks and seeps. The strands of market law and war tightened together. A season of converging marches would follow. Autumn 1874 opened with a plan to end free movement on the southern plains. Federal command set converging columns to sweep the Canadian river breaks and the Caprock canyons, and to drive every camp toward the agency posts. Columns moved from posts in Indian Territory from the Brazos and Concho line in Texas and from the Kansas Supply Road. The purpose was simple: cut the horse-based burn winter stores and force surrenders at the agencies. The risk was also simple. Water was far apart. Trails vanished on the Llano Estacado. Wagons broke and mules failed under heat and wind. Guides and scouts from allied nations kept columns to seeps and crossings and read the breaks for trails that horses could climb. The 4th Cavalry, under a hard-riding commander, left the Concho country in early September. Pack trains carried hard-bread coffee and cartridges, and mules dragged spare shoes and nails. Infantry detachments from the northern line pushed south and west out of Kansas and Indian Territory posts to block escape toward the Arkansas. Troops in Indian Territory moved northwest to deny the route to the Washita and the Red River forks. The columns kept distance between them but watched for sign and smoke. Couriers ran at night to trade bearings. Each movement aimed to find camps heavy with winter gear when the first cold narrowed choices. Rules of engagement were written in clear lines. Destroy caches and lodges, seize remounts, shoot captured horses that could not be moved, take families to the agency posts for issue and control. The object was not a single set-piece fight, but a series of blows against food shelter and animals until councils concluded that the open hunt was over. Officers wrote that casualties in skirmishes would be lower than the harm done by hunger if lodges and meat stores were destroyed. The moral weight of that choice sits in the reports and in the winter accounts kept later by families. The march into Palo Duro country began with a cold front and haze in the draws. Scouts pointed to a faint drift of smoke under the rim and to tracks that slipped down into cedar. At first light, a column slid off the caprock into the upper forks. Camp circles lay below among cottonwoods. Dogs barked and horses snorted, and the first shots cracked along the timber. Men ran for the herds, but troopers pushed between lodge lines and the picket ropes. Some families broke out alongside ravines. Others lost their mounts in the first minutes. The fight was brief and scattered in the trees and cutbanks. Reports list few killed in the canyon, and the numbers vary in later accounts. The lodges did not survive. Food stores were pulled out and burned of 97. Winter clothing and gear went into the fires. The horse herd was driven up to the rim, and the count rose into the thousands. Later that day and the next, many of those animals were shot because the column could not feed them and could not guard them in the open. Smoke marked the canyon walls for hours. Field order excerpt are operations. Note: Concho to Canadian line. September 1874. Destroy lodges, meat stores, and winter gear. Seize serviceable horses. Shoot those that cannot be moved. Bring families to the agency posts. News of Palo Duro traveled fast. Columns to the east and north tightened their sweeps. Along Tule country, troopers found fresh lodges abandoned in haste with meat drying in the wind. Contact at McClellan Creek saw short, sharp skirmishes as mounted fighters tried to draw pursuit away from families moving up side draws. Again, the reports note limited casualties, but heavy loss in gear and horses. In several cases, officers recorded cutting loose horses that could not be guarded, only to find them shot by detachments ordered to deny remounts to anyone outside the column. The logic of the plan was ruthless. Without horses, movement failed. Without meat and robes, the cold finished the work. On the northern line, infantry and cavalry detachments blocked crossings toward the Arkansas. The country grew open and flat, and the distances grew longer between pools. Soldiers dug for water in dry beds and cached flour and bacon at known springs. When the wind shifted to the north, patrols found smokes set to decoy the chase and followed them into empty ground, while families doubled back under the caprock. Scouts learned to count ash heaps and to read grass torn by hurried horse lines, to measure the size of a camp that had passed. Several meetings ended in talk rather than fire, when groups without horses chose to approach with a white cloth and accepted escort to the agency. In other cases, warnings to surrender gave way to disarmament and to separation of men from families for movement under guard. Captain, after action note: Tule country, November 1874. Few enemy dead in the ravines. Many women and children surrendered with little to eat. We burned near all the lodges and destroyed dried meat. Horse flesh was the principal loss to them. The season will do the rest. South and west of the Canadian Breaks, patrols probed the heads of the Red River forks. The canyons here were deep and sudden. Trails ran along shelves no wider than a wagon tongue and dropped to sand that swallowed hooves. A misstep by a pack mule could pull a whole string into a fall. Columns learned to travel at first light and to stop before dark to post pickets on both rims. Raiders struck at night to loose the herd ropes and to drive off a remnant of horses. Those raids were the last flashes of the older pattern. Each success kept a band moving for a week more. Each failure put more people on the path to the agency post near Fort Sill. The policy track worked in parallel to the field track. Agents logged surrenders through winter and into spring. Issue days counted flour, coffee, sugar, and salt, and marked the first season when many families ate most of their food under Army Guard. School lists began. Prisoner selections were made for transfer to distant posts. The correspondence shows a cold, administrative tone. Numbers filled lines. Age, sex, and band were noted. The language does not capture the loss of horses that had carried wealth and memory and the work of a way of life. Casualty reporting during the campaign deserves a clear frame. Numbers in canyon fights are small in most officer returns. Ranges in the records reflect scattered contact across rough ground and the difficulty of counting in smoke and wind. The totals for horses seized and later shot are large. Reports from Palo Duro Canyon place the number in the thousands, and several hundred to more than 1,000 were killed when the column could not bring them in. Later writers have blamed or praised single officers for these decisions. The orders and returns show that the policy was general and repeated by more than one command. The Red River War has often been told as a string of battles, naming adobe walls, then Palo Duro, and a handful of skirmishes as decisive nodes. Fact and folklore must be separated. Adobe walls in June 1874 signaled that long guns behind thick walls could blunt a mounted charge. Palo Duro Canyon in September 1874 signaled that lodges and stored food could be reached in their deepest shelters if columns moved with silent night marches and had able scouts. Neither day alone ended the system. The coordination of columns, the deliberate destruction of horse herds and meat stores, and the absence of buffalo on the southern ranges set the decisive conditions. The winter finished what the field orders began. Weather mattered every day. Blue northers drove sleet across the open and turned the land to iron at dawn and to sucking mud by noon. Troops learned to wrap blankets in their saddle rolls and to march with coats open to vent sweat, then close them before halts to hold heat. Families without lodges and robes faced the same wind with less shelter. Fires at night required fuel and gave away position. The army cut scrub for fires and sent men with axes to the nearest timber when camped below the caprock. Many lines in the returns are about wood and water rather than shots fired. A second contact with canyon camps late in the season underscores the plan. After Palo Duro, a remnant band tried to hide inside branches of the breaks. Scouts found fresh sign, and the column forced a descent down a shale slope. Horses slid and men braced on tails and manes. The column reached the floor and moved at a trot through cottonwood and willow. The first lodges appeared in a bend with meat racks still smoking. Most people ran for the horse lines. In minutes, the ropes were cut by troopers, and the herd rushed into a blind draw. A few riders broke free and vanished into a slot toward the rim. After that contact, officers reported again, few enemy dead, and again many horses seized and later shot. Winter food stores and lodge covers went into the fire. Lieutenant Lash orders. Excerpt. Indian Territory Agency line. December 1874, no issue will be made to armed parties away from the post except by written order. On surrender, all arms to be turned over. Horses to be counted and held. Men selected by the agent and the commanding officer for transfer. By January 1875, the lines had closed. Families came into Fort Sill in groups. Names and numbers went into the books. Leaders who had evaded contact through the fall and early winter used the last of their horses to try for a spring move toward the open range. Scout reports and patrols blocked those routes. The record shows repeated small surrenders rather than one moment of general capitulation. Each entry lists families' children and a ledger of goods issued. Few lines note the earlier wealth in horseflesh that is not coming back into camp with them. A last point about command and units belongs here because it shapes how the campaign is remembered. The 4th Cavalry drove the main canyon blow from the Texas side. Infantry and cavalry from the northern line held crossings and probed the Canadian forks. Troops from Indian Territory pinned the route to the Washita and the Red River Agency. Allied scouts from several nations guided and screened. The effect was cumulative. No single regiment, no single officer, and no single day stands apart from the plan that tied them together. This is the difference between a raid and a campaign. A raid takes goods, animals, and captives and moves fast to avoid a set fight. A campaign takes the means to live and does not release pressure until quit lines fill a ledger. By the thaw of early spring, the work of the field had become the work of the agency. The confrontation phase had ended. The policy phase moved to the center. The next winter would not find open camps on the Caprock. The horse empire had lost its animals and its food stores. The people would continue under a different set of rules written at posts and agencies rather than on the trail. The turning point ran across one season. It began with the canyon fires in late September 1874 and ended with surrenders at Fort Sill in late spring 1875. The objective for the Army was to remove mobility and food. The constraint was distance, water, and weather. The objective for the Numunu was to preserve horse herds and winter stores long enough to reach new grass or new trade. The constraint was the loss of animals and the absence of buffalo on the southern ranges. After the lodges and caches burned in Palo Duro country, the first effect was felt inside the camps. Families counted blankets and shot pouches and found the numbers short. Riders who still had mounts could screen a move for a day or two. Those on foot could not close the gap to the herds. The old pattern required a week to settle a shaken camp. Now a camp had hours. When blue northers came, the cold bit through robes that had been saved for 2 winters. The march between side canyons that once was routine became a test of strength and luck. At the same time, the market closed. Traders on the New Mexico rim watched the wires and the roads and chose not to risk seizure for a small profit. Mexican patrols along the old fords grew more regular. Hide stacks at the Canadian line told a simple truth. The southern herd was nearly gone. The treaty clause that tied hunting rights to the presence of buffalo did not bend. A party that left the agency to hunt risked arrest even if no game was found. That rule did not need to be argued in councils. It was enforced in the open when a patrol rode up and asked for weapons. Skirmishes in October and November 1874 kept pressure on families still moving. Near the Toole country and along McClellan Creek, mounted fighters tried to draw pursuit away from women, children, and the last of the pack animals. Casualties in these contacts were limited. The larger loss followed every short fight. Horses were taken. Meat racks and lodges were burned. The next morning began with fewer animals and less food than the morning before. The arithmetic grew stark by December. Inside the posts, the paperwork recorded the turn in a dry tone. Orders were issued to limit rations to those present at the agency. Men marked for transfer were listed with age and band. In January and February, small groups came in under a white cloth and were escorted to the ration window. Some were people who had never stood in an agency line. Others had tried to live between the posts and the Caprock and no longer could. The names in the books include headmen, known from earlier fights, and traders' lists, and many women and children who enter the record for the first time at the moment when the old economy ended. Leadership choices narrowed with each week. A Quahati leader named Quanah Parker held out the longest with families who still had mounts and knew the side canyons. The aim was to find grass shelter and a way to the plains north of the Canadian, where game might last another season. Scouts reported movements. Columns adjusted routes. By late May and early June 1875, the last large holdout group gave up the attempt and came to Fort Sill. The sequence was not a single moment of ceremony. It was a line of small meetings that added up to closure. One entry from the hunting side shows how outsiders understood what they had helped to do, even if they did not say it in official terms. Adobe walls, Hunter diary excerpt, Canadian River breaks, July 1874. We shoot the herds for hides and ship them east. The plains will be empty soon. It is not our concern what follows. The admission is plain. A market that lay outside the councils and outside the forts erased the center of the seasonal round. That is why the loss of horses at the canyon mattered as more than a local blow. Horses without a hunt could not feed a nation. A hunt without buffalo was a line on paper. The human cost sat in that gap. Women with infants took agency flour and coffee and learned the routine of issue day. Men who had measured wealth in horse lines woke to a corral that belonged to someone else. Children were placed on school lists. People who had known long rides across the level land walked short distances inside a post and waited for their number. Winter counts and ledger drawings from the region marked the season with images of horses taken or shot and of lodges burning under a high rim. The pictures are small and steady. They do not show a duel and a shout. They show work undone and a way of life set aside under pressure. Evidence-based counterfactuals help fix the weight of causes. If the southern herd had been protected by law in 1872, the seasonal hunt might have lasted a few years longer, and so might mounted resistance. If the horses seized at Palo Duro had been corralled rather than shot, some bands could have tried for the Arkansas hunt in 1875 and perhaps reached it. The market and policy forces described in earlier parts would still have tightened. The timeline would stretch, the outcome would likely converge. Names anchor the end of the season. Quanah Parker appears in agency notes at Fort Sill in 1875 with families who had crossed the Caprock country for the last time under arms. Other leaders from Allied camps appear in prisoner lists and transfer orders to distant posts. Not all Comanche prisoners went east, but some Southern Plains prisoners did. The difference in paths underlines the structure of the policy. Risk leaders were removed. Others were bound to the ration line and the school roll. Fact and folklore touch here. Later memory sometimes tells of a single clash that ended a horse empire in a day. The record shows that the decisive act was to take food and animals and then to wait for winter to keep doing that work. Fights in the open did happen. They are counted in returns. The hinge is not a list of enemy dead. It is a ledger of horses seized meat burned and families escorted under guard to an agency that controlled flour and coffee. When spring came on the Red River line in 1875, the grass grew as it always had. The difference was that the horses which once turned that grass into motion were in army corrals or lay dead on the rims above the canyons, and the buffalo that once turned that grass into food and hides were gone from the southern ranges. The practical meaning of power had changed. It no longer meant the choice of when to appear and when to vanish. It meant the day of the week when issue was made and the list a child's name was written on. The season is a turning point because it converts the structural forces from P2 into lived facts. Markets removed the herd. Field orders removed the horses and gear. Agency practice fixed movement and food. The initiative that once flowed from speed and grass now flowed from ledgers and guards. The people endured. The system that had carried them across open land for generations did not. The summer after the canyon fires, the work of war turned into the work of administration. At Fort Sill and nearby agency posts, clerks opened ledgers and began new lines for Numunu families who had not stood in such lines before. Rations were issued by schedule. Flour, coffee, sugar, and salt appeared on fixed days and were checked against rolls. When wagons were late or the stores ran short, the gap showed at once in the camp. Prisoner lists selected men for transfer to distant posts and used the same columns that counted age band and household. Children were entered on school rosters with English names beside their own. These pages survive in agency books and in the correspondence files of the Indian Territory superintendents. Army returns from the Red River and Washita posts match the same months and list the numbers of horses seized during the campaign and the small totals of arms turned in on surrender. Reservation boundaries, fixed movement. Lines on a map replace the older seasonal arcs between the Arkansas country and the Red River forks. Early in the first year, the agency built corrals for issue cattle and tried to start gardens with seed corn and farm tools drawn from departmental stores. A blacksmith shop appeared in the records with counts of plow repairs and horseshoeing. The policy aim was to redirect labor from herding and hunting into fenced fields and wage work. Some families tried the fields in the bottomlands near the post and took wages cutting hay for army stock. Others left at the first report of buffalo sign and were turned back by patrols or returned because there was no game to be found. Letters from the agent to the department explain both results in a flat tone and ask for more seed and more tools for the next season. Land and resource use shifted fast in the larger region. Grazing leases grew on former hunting grounds as ranchers moved herds along water and rail spurs reached closer to the Canadian and Red River crossings. Contracts for grass appear in territorial records within a few years of the surrenders. Hide buyers turned to northern railheads as the southern herd was gone. Survey notes marked section lines that had not mattered when the measure of distance was a day's ride. The same grass that once fed bison and horse herds now fed cattle that moved east by rail. County papers and freight receipts record the new direction of profit. Demography and health are visible in the census lines, kept by agents, and in the special reports sent after epidemics. Smallpox and other fevers had struck the Numunu in earlier decades, and the records for the first reservation years still show spikes in mortality when disease ran through camps that now sat close together with little shelter in cold weather. Birth numbers rise as rations stabilize, then fall back in years when issue is cut or delayed. Mission doctors notice lung disease and the effects of winter exposure in the months after the Canyon campaign, when many people lacked robes and proper lodges. The tone in these notes is clinical and sometimes harsh. The facts are simple. Cold and hunger took lives after the horses were gone, before rations and shelter were steady. Law and policy worked through small instruments. An arrest order sent men to holdouts who left the line without written permission. A pass system fixed the hours when a person could leave to cut wood or fetch water. A ration rule denied issue to anyone found with a weapon outside the post without a permit. The effect was to translate the old question of mobility into a daily set of permissions. Agency letters and post orders describe these rules in plain language and set penalties for breaking them. They also record moments of discretion when an officer or agent allowed a family to travel for a funeral or a ceremony or to visit a relative in a nearby camp. Cultural continuance did not end inside these rules. Ceremonies moved to the margins of the post and to the river bottoms, where distance and trees gave some cover from watchful eyes. Songs and stories continued in lodges and later in frame houses put up near the agency. Ledger drawings from the period show horses taken at the canyon and riders in rows as they once moved on the open land, and they also show ration issue and the schoolhouse with its bell. Winter counts compiled by neighboring nations note the year of many horses shot and the year of agency flour. A few years later, they note a return to mounted travel for visits and dances on certain days, even when long rides across the plains were no longer possible. These images and notations function as records in their own right, and their dates align with the agency books and the Army returns. Education policy reached deep. School placements listed children by household and set hours for attendance and for the use of English in class and on the grounds. Some pupils left the roles in planting and harvest seasons to work with families. Others remained at the post through winters and learned letters and numbers and the routine of drills and hymns. Inspectors wrote that instruction should replace the old seasonal round. Parents argued in council that the round was already broken by the loss of buffalo and the horses, and that the school must teach skills that could earn wages under the new order. Minutes of those councils exist in superintendent files. They are brief and formal, but they show the core dispute over what kind of work and what kind of knowledge had value when the open country no longer answered to riders, memory, and public life. Gathered at posts and later in town spaces. Veterans of later wars from the community formed honor lines at gatherings and carried flags. Families held commemorations for those lost in the hard winter after Palo Duro and for earlier raids and fights. Horses returned to the center of events as symbols, even when they no longer carried a nation across the plains. Photographs from the end of the century show riders in decorated gear beside agency buildings and schoolhouses, and show men and women in mixed dress that speaks to both older styles and the demands of policy and work. These images sit beside written records and make the same point in a different form. A people continued in new conditions. Today, the nation known in English as the Comanche Nation uses the autonym Numunu, and is centered in southwestern Oklahoma. Government services, health programs, and education and language initiatives operate from offices near Lawton and in community centers across the area. Elders groups teach songs, stories, and crafts. Veterans organizations support service members and lead processionals at public events. Youth riders and dancers appear at gatherings that move along old routes by modern roads. Tribal court dockets show daily matters of law and family under tribal codes. These present-day structures are the current form of self-government built on a history that the agency books and winter counts both describe from different angles. The literature that anchors this aftermath is broad and specific. Army returns list animals seized and destroyed and provide dates for patrols after surrender. Agency ration registers and school rolls show who received food and who attended class by week and month. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge text explains the clause that tied hunting rights to the presence of buffalo, and the later correspondence files contain the argument about that clause when the herds were gone. Congressional testimony on Indian policy in the 1870s and 1880s includes statements from agents and officers who served on the Red River line and spoke about the campaign and its consequences. Trader ledgers from New Mexico towns describe the end of profitable exchange with mounted parties and the rise of contracts with army posts. County papers and freight invoices from railheads show the shift to cattle and the routes that replace the old trails. The point of assembling these records is not to flatten experience into lists. It is to show that the change from movement to fixed life happened in steps that can be dated and crossed with more than one kind of source. The aftermath is not a quiet slope downward from a single dramatic day. It is a series of decisions by officers, agents, traders, and families under pressure from hunger and cold and the absence of buffalo. It is also a series of continuities in song language and community that do not need a horse herd to exist. The season that broke the old system did not end the Numunu. The record shows loss measured in horses and in names on ration rolls, and also shows a people who adapted to a new order and kept their identity in plain sight. Across the long arc of the southern plains, the consensus is clear. The Numunu, also known as the Comanche, built regional power by turning grass into horses and horses into speed trade and coercive choice. Mobility set the initiative. Markets at New Mexico towns and across the Rio Grande converted hides, meat, and animals into metal powder and cloth. For 2 centuries, this system linked season weather and exchange. Its collapse came when 2 foundations were removed at once. The southern bison herds were taken by the hide trade, and the horse base was seized and destroyed in the Red River campaign. Reservation policy then fixed movement and ration control. Power that had flowed from herds' routes and surprise shifted to ledgers, schedules, and posts. Scholars also converge on scale. Comancheria was not a border on a map, but an elastic field of influence that moved with grasswater and horses. The state actors around that field changed across time. Spain, Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and the United States Army each sought to redirect or contain Numunu power rather than erase it outright until the early 1870s. When market and military aims aligned, the end came quickly, not because one battle was decisive, but because the system could not operate without animals and open range. Points of debate remain. Reports disagree on casualties at Plum Creek and on several canyon contacts where smoke, dust, and broken terrain made counting unreliable. Totals of horses seized and shot after Palo Duro vary by return and later retelling. The weight of disease versus warfare and population decline also shifts among authors. Some narratives center named leaders and single days. The record shows long sequences driven by logistics, weather orders, and markets. Fact and folklore must be held apart. Adobe Walls is remembered as a duel between riders and rifles. In function, it was a signal that long guns behind walls had changed the risk of assault. Palo Duro is cast as a conclusive victory. In function, it was one blow in a season that removed food, shelter, and horses and left winter to decide. Continuance is part of the same history. Ceremony, language, kinship, and public life adapted inside new limits. Ledger Art Winter counts agency ledgers and photographs in the decades after 1875, show both loss and persistence. Present-day governance, culture, and service in the Comanche Nation Center on southwestern Oklahoma, and carry the story forward in law, education, language, and community events. The horse empire ended. The people did not. This episode endures because it shows how landscape animals, markets, and policy can build a mobile power across open country, and how the removal of its foundations can end a system in one hard season, while a nation continues in new forms. A horse economy turned grass into power until horses and buffalo were removed in one hard season. If you had to rank the causes which mattered most, the hide market, the horse losses at Palo Duro, or reservation policy, what one detail changed your view of Comancheria? Tell us your top factor and why.